Hello and thank you for joining the Pure Experts Engagement Series 2021. This is our third event in the series. I'm Charlotte Gentry, CEO and founder of Pure Communications Group, and I'm delighted to be broadcasting live today from Celebro Media Studios in central London. We are discussing a really exciting topic today, and one that's on the forefront of many people's minds, which is how to navigate the continually evolving landscape of virtual, hybrid and live experiences, and how we actually integrate all of those into our strategy moving forwards over the next 6 to 9 months. We're obviously very much looking forward to coming back to live, but there is a journey that we're all going on as a result. And so we're going to be discussing that with our selection of panellists today. And I'm very excited to be joined by Claire Fenello, who is the Executive Director of EVCOM, and she's joining me in the studio today as well, which is fantastic. It's very, very important that we get as much feedback as we can from our audience, because we aim to improve our content as much as we can over the course of these events. And so please do submit any feedback to us, and also please do submit lots of questions, because we'd love to answer them today as well. So with that in mind, it would be great to introduce our panelists, and I will also have a quick chat with Claire. Thank you for joining me, Claire, in the studio today. It's so lovely to see you in person after not being able to see anyone for such a long time. It's so exciting.
It's absolutely brilliant to be here. I can't tell you, I'm beyond excited to be in London.
Well, it's great to have you here, because as the Executive Director of our Creative and Events Industry Association, EVCOM, it would be really lovely to hear how your journey has progressed over the last year, because you took the role, in fact, back in January 2020, when the pandemic was just about to kick off. So your role's been very, very different, hasn't it?
It has. So I joined EVCOM sort of middle of January 2020 with a certain expectation of what the job would involve. And literally within about 8 weeks, I was tucked up back at home again in leafy Hertfordshire, and then not coming into London at all. And a lot of EVCOM's outreach and a lot of the way we get revenue is through live events. You know, we do a lot of work to bring our membership in, and giving them networking opportunities and training opportunities, and we do awards programs, we do all sorts, and all of that just ground to an immediate halt. So whilst I was still getting to grips with who the members were and what they wanted and how they wanted to work with us, we had to do a really, really swift rethink about how we were going to engage with our members. On the plus side, we're a very small team, so it did mean that we could respond quite quickly. I could get round and speak to a lot of people on the phone, find out what we could do, and we very, very quickly launched ourselves into the virtual world, which for me was very new. I have to confess, you know, I'd done Skype calls and things like that, but I'd never had to do anything sort of in that space. But luckily, you know, we had a very understanding membership, so the first few iterations were possibly a little clumsy, but we got to grips with it really, really quickly. And I think our membership really appreciated it. We did an awful lot in those first few months. We were putting something out every week. And then we also, our awards programs had to go virtual, and that was a very steep learning curve. But again, supported by our members, you know, we got access to wonderful facilities, and we just got on with it, really. And it's proved very, very successful in keeping us front of mind with our membership. What has been harder is the revenue piece. Finding ways to still give that value, that the sort of monetary value to an event that people will want to sponsor or people will want to pay to come to, has been hard. And I think we're still a long way from that.
Well, Claire, you've done the most phenomenal job, because obviously having to adapt, you've had to adapt and evolve more than most people in the sector, just to make sure that the drive of content that you've had to be producing has been absolutely enormous. So yes, absolutely. Well, I think what I'm going to do is turn to our panellists. We've got some incredible panellists today. Which is, we're very excited to have everybody here. So perhaps I can ask you all, we've got James, who is on the board of the ICCA, as well as being a director at Excel. We've got Sarah Threlfall from Brightspace. We've also got Emma Hilditch from the Virtual Events Institute, and Pete Bradbury, who's our technical producer at Pure. So thank you all very much for joining. We are, just to flag it, we have actually got a fifth panellist who is currently having a few issues trying to get in. So as soon as she does, we'll be delighted to welcome Abina Poku from Hogan Lovells as well. However, I thought we should kick off really just talking about the highs and lows and the pros and cons really of the virtual world. Obviously, we have had to really engage in virtual over the last year, and for some people there have been some huge positives with that, and for others it's not been quite so easy. So perhaps before we just kick off with that, perhaps I could ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves and explain a little bit about what they do. So perhaps I could start with James.
Thank you, Charlotte. Very briefly, as you said, I'm Executive Director at Excel London. So we've been dealing with a pivot, that word we've all been using for the last year, a pivot from being a major convention and exhibition centre to being first of all, a Nightingale hospital, subsequently a mass vaccination centre. So we've been very proud to work with the NHS through the last year to support the cause. In between, we've been hosting a lot of filming. There's been an opportunity for HBO and BBC and Netflix to use our halls for filming. So we've been adapting there. And then separately, as ICA president, the International Congress and Convention Association, been helping steer that association, similar to the work Claire's been doing. But also, perhaps I can, on this session, share the experience we had of hosting our first ever hybrid congress back in November. So I'm happy to share those learnings.
That's fantastic, James. Thank you very much. That will be very invaluable, I'm sure. Sarah, perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about what you do, because you're very much within the health and safety arena, and how that's going to impact our return to live.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working largely as an event director for my career, but have recently turned lots of practical risk assessment experience and event health and safety training into more formal qualifications, and have also then started to advise my clients on COVID safe procedures. So largely I've been working with filming and virtual events, but as people have got braver, the sets have got bigger, the crews have got bigger. So, we are dealing with sort of 40, 50 people at times. And I've also been working on a training course for other event planners and corporate buyers, and basically anyone in the events industry, to try and make sure that we're having a collaborative approach and everybody's aware of how much this is going to change the way we need to approach our events.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you very much indeed. Emma, so you have been working for the Virtual Events Institute and been very involved in training programs and the different products available within the virtual arena. Perhaps you could explain a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I've been a content person for most of my event career. And then in August, I joined the launch team at the Virtual Events Institute, where we started to put together a training program to help all our colleagues in events who have been running physical events for their whole careers and who are very confident and had the knowledge to do that. We wanted to create a program that could help them pivot really quickly to running virtual events. So we created a on-demand 11-module program that you can kind of sit through and take at your leisure, that fills in all the gaps that you might have if you've mostly run physical events and now you're looking to run virtual or hybrid events.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think your experience is going to be invaluable today, having run so many of those programs. And Pete, as our technical producer, I mean, obviously you've seen all sorts of different setups. Perhaps you can explain a little bit about some of the stuff you've been doing.
Well, we've been working on a mixture of conferences and award shows recently, and it's nice to come across new challenges and new problems. I've been in the industry for sort of 15 years now, and even the last 6 to 12 months, new challenges have come up that we didn't experience in the live arena. And it's exciting to find new ways to solve them, give people more opportunities to experience events, even if it is from home at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So just starting to open the conversation really about virtual, I'm going to go back to James in terms of what we feel has worked and what the pros and cons have been and what your journey's actually felt like.
Well, I'll share my best experiences from the ICA Congress. ICA hosts its annual Congress somewhere in the world every year. Last year it was in Kaohsiung in Taiwan. And Taiwan was a country actually where they were dealing with the pandemic extremely well. But we were limited in the number of people that could go there because of quarantining, etc. So we took the decision to go hybrid, right? We didn't go virtual. We were wanting to do as much face-to-face as we possibly could. And for an event that traditionally attracts about 1,000 to 1,100 delegates, we actually had our highest attendance ever of 1,500 paying attendees. But 600 of those, so 40%, were face-to-face, both in Kaohsiung, but also we called it a hub and spoke. So you had the main center in Kaohsiung, but we had hubs all around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, etc. So 600 real-time attendees, 900 virtual attendees, and we were able, by using the hub and spoke model, to monetize some sponsorship opportunities beyond the host city in Kaohsiung. The biggest challenge for me, and I think the challenge facing clients that we're talking to at Excel for possible events this autumn and into 2022, is the cost. If you look at a hybrid model, you have both the traditional cost of set, venue hire, all the tech elements and the logistics that we all know go into a face-to-face event. And then you layer on top of that the digital element, which has to be, for us, it was very strong, but it was also very expensive. Claire will be pleased to know we used one of the EVCOM members, DRPG. Normally I would have been on stage in Kaohsiung, but I was live from Kidderminster in the West Midlands.
The glamour.
And very, very glamorous, absolutely. But I have to say, it was the investment. That's where, for us, the investment was worthwhile. It looked like, and the comments back from membership, it looked like a full TV, like a Newsnight performance, if you like, TV performance with me. We had an anchor host, a professional host, me as president, and then we were linking in the various speakers from around the world. I think we should come onto content later in this discussion, but that was the key for me, was paying for professionals to do a really professional job. We couldn't have just stuck a Zoom frame and popped it online. It would have been a disaster. So that was the big takeout from ICA's Congress point of view.
That's really, really interesting to hear. And actually, one of the key points actually that we were going to discuss was very much around the difficulty around cost, because that's obviously almost doubled now as a result of having to have all the extra equipment and production involved. And we will come on to the discussion with the hybrid model in a little while. But that's great. I think perhaps Emma, maybe you could give us some valuable insight on perhaps some of the platforms that you've come across, and maybe I think. From what I understand, when I've been talking to a lot of our clients, people are very, very embedded in the choice of the platform that they use to deliver the events. Do you think that's really where the focus needs to be?
Well, no, I don't really at all, actually. I mean, that's like going shopping without a shopping list when you're really hungry and just buying everything that you fancy and then coming home and looking at it and you're like, oh, I can't make a meal from that. That's what it's like if you start with the platform, which you definitely don't want to do. So you've got to take a step back, like we would do in physical environment, and say, who's the event for? What do they want? What's the content going to be? What format do we want to deliver it in? You need to think through all of those things. And when you've thought through all of those things, then you can make a really great shopping list that you can then go out to the market with. I mean, it's quite difficult to advise on particular platforms. At the last count, I think there were 550.
James, can you just
So
tilt
there were
your
new
camera down
platforms all the
please?
time. Plus, there
so
is
your head-
consolidation starting to happen. So there are platforms combining with each other. I think maybe the interesting thing to note, so apart from like knowing what you're looking for, the other thing to note, if you haven't already been down this road, is that every platform, there aren't platforms really that do everything. So if you know that networking is really key for your event, you need to pick a networking app potentially that works with a streaming app. So people talk about building a technology stack rather than just choosing one platform that's going to do everything. So you do need to get your head around that. And in terms of the technology, sometimes I know you just said, James, that and your event sounded absolutely amazing, and obviously, you know, it's fantastic to use the studio, and I think what we're looking at today is a really great example of how the studio is working really, really well. But potentially it isn't for every event, you know, and sometimes Zoom does work really well depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Do you think, I think a lot of people think or have thought over the past year that actually, okay, we used to do an event at this time every year, and therefore our only option is to take that event now online. Do you think that's absolutely the right default for people to take? And, it's not, I'm probably asking a loaded question here, but it's not necessarily possible just to take the live experience and try to put it online. And I think perhaps maybe that's a pitfall that some people might be falling into.
Yeah, Charlotte, absolutely. I don't know if people are doing it anymore, but definitely, this time last year, when everyone was in panic mode, they were just like, how can I pivot my event, my annual event, and how can I do it again? How can I do it this year? But of course, we have, once you've got time to take a breath and step back and really think about what your program does and what your delegates want, obviously, then you can pick in virtual. There's a raft of different formats. You can have your annual event. You can have it over a week. You can have it compressed into a very short space of time. You can provide it on demand only. You can provide it over a month. There are lots and lots of things that you can do in terms of format. I think, most people are thinking more broadly now. And it's also quite interesting to think about the different ways that you can maybe monetize that. If you're charging people to attend your event, you can think about what people want to pay for now and what they're actually going to do there.
Yeah, well, that's also a very important part of it, isn't it? And I just wonder whether we've seen actually all that there is to offer with regards to virtual, whether we can still elevate that virtual experience, or whether we now are where we are. And I just wonder, Pete, in terms of what you've produced and what you've seen, do you think there's a way that we can actually really network in a virtual capacity? Do you think there are ways to really make that work?
I'm not sure virtual networking will ever be as good as in-person networking. I don't think you get the same vibe from other people, no matter what platform you use. But echoing what Emma said, you need to consider the platform like the venue for your event. We've moved on such a long way in the last 6 months from where we were. Now a proper platform event is much more normal than it was 6 months ago. And, we're not trying to force massive show onto Teams or Zoom anymore. It's a much better way to be working. And with with VR improving and VR platforms improving, it's now possible to put people in an actual event space, incorporate, lighting and sound like it were a real event. But I think there's still a desire to go back to real face-to-face networking.
Yeah, I'm sure that has to be true, and we'll come on to the safety elements of that shortly, and what that actually means, because I think from what we're hearing, there's definitely an appetite to move back to a live environment. Emma, you have something you'd like to say?
I just wanted to add something, onto the networking point, because I feel like networking and indeed actually audience engagement, they're two things that in physical we kind of assumed happened. So if someone was sitting in a conference room facing the front, we were like, okay, great, they're engaged, they're listening, which obviously they could easily not be listening, they could be daydreaming, they could be looking at their phone or whatever. But we deemed them as engaged, and it's the same with networking. We had a big room full of people, there was a buzz, people were talking, and we were like, yeah, great, it was great networking, everyone was chatting. But the reality is actually that loads of people at those big physical events were too shy to really network in person, didn't really know how to do it, didn't really came away not feeling fulfilled on the networking front. And I think that in having to think really hard about how to make networking work in virtual, that will be reflected when we go to hybrid and when we go to physical as well. And I feel like helping people with more structured networking, which is what we have to do in virtual, has been really successful. And we've had really good feedback from delegates in that compared to their experience at physical events. And my last point is that, the digital native generation, which is our next generation of delegates, they're constantly networking in their social lives on digital platforms. And I mean, the success of Clubhouse really reflects that. So I think we probably shouldn't just dismiss it. That's all I wanted to say.
And it's a really, really valid point. We have to consider, dare I say, the next generation of people who are absolutely strapped to a smartphone and are used to doing everything in a digital capacity. So that's absolutely 100%. We've actually got some.
We have some polls.
We have some polls
Yes.
that we'd like to for the audience to participate in.
So could we ask the technicians to please put the first poll up for people to see? There are 3. So if I can just highlight the first. Are you planning on hosting only virtual events until the end of 2021? So we'll give people a few seconds to respond. It's a yes or a no. So the question, are you planning only virtual events until the end of 2021?
Be interesting to see whether or not actually some people are thinking about going very much back to live come September, October, and what the mixture is there.
Yes, I think people are just waiting to figure out which way to jump.
Exactly.
Everyone's. I think we're all planning for everything, planning for every eventuality.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Hi, Claire. Hi, Claire.
Hi.
Of that poll here, and it's about 50-50. It's 45% yes, 55% no.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Sorry, I was waiting for it to come up on my screen, but it hadn't.
It's come up on mine.
Oh, all right. Someone has the answer, so that's all right then. So around 50-50. So, seems to indicate that exactly everyone's hedging their bets. Everyone is just literally week by week looking at the news and the state of play. And I know EVCOM in particular, we're looking at our first conference and wondering how we're going to do that. So the second poll, so if you can get ready for this one. Do you think virtual has been a good substitute for live events? Do you think virtual has been a good substitute for live events? And I'm presuming, Pete, you're going to get the answers this time as well, so I'll rely on you.
That's a big no. That's 70% no, 30% yes.
Oh.
That's very interesting, isn't it?
I think it's such early days though as well. I think people are possibly not yet wholly comfortable, and Emma might attest to this. They're not wholly comfortable with the virtual experience yet. So we still cling on to how great we think live is. I think maybe if you look at it about 18 months down the road, people might have a different view.
Yeah, of course.
Because we're still in that position of not being in our comfort zones.
Yeah.
So
Emma, is there something that you wanted to add?
I just wanted to say yes. And the other thing is, of course, the virtual events that we've experienced have been the ones that we've rushed to do. Yeah. And virtual events are only getting better, and they're getting so much better, so much more quickly. So I would probably say that the question, if it was like, have the virtual events that you've been to over the last 6 months compared with physical, no. But going forward, like Claire said, in the next 18 months, they probably will improve. Yes, people talk about screen fatigue, but I think they've probably got bad event fatigue more, because we're still watching Netflix, aren't we? We don't mind.
It's not the screen that's the problem. Yeah. So the third and final poll is: are you planning hybrid events in 2021? So again, are you planning hybrid events in 2021? And we are. So the EV conference we are looking to do in July 21st. We're pushing ourselves forward, and it's going to be a hybrid event, but we're confident that we'll be able to deliver both parts of that.
James, I think there's something that you wanted to add as well.
Yeah, just reflection on virtual, the pros and cons. One of the speakers that spoke at the ICA Congress, a gentleman called Bob Bajan, he's one of the senior VPs for Microsoft over in the States. He talked about one of their events where they, for the face-to-face event in America, they had 26 delegates from Africa the previous years. When they ran it virtually, they had over 6,000 attendees. So there was an uptick there, but it was virtual only. It wasn't hybrid, it was virtual. Separately, though, I've had another corporate client, one of Excel's clients, say they had a big uptick in delegate registrations for one of their events, a one-day event. But when they measured the average dwell time for all those delegates, and it was many, many thousands of them, it was about 10 minutes. So it comes back to some of the comments that have already been made around content and curation. I think that's, again, something we can talk about. But there's some great positive stories, but some big negatives as well. And I think we have to remember, I think any of us who've attended these events, we always have to remember we're watching some of these streaming events, but there's always that temptation to check your email at the same time. So the engagement quality for long periods is very, very difficult to achieve. Should
we just get the, Pete, do you have the results from the third poll?
I do. That's 55% of people saying that they are planning a hybrid event in 2021, and only 45% saying no. And I think that's probably a good indication that they're going to be a thing going forwards. I mean, we did one during the 30-person meeting session, and it was a big success, and everyone at home was more than happy with it.
Right. So, okay. I think it also just depends on people's scheduling as well, and what they would normally have had lined up in the second half of the year, and what they feel capable of delivering, and what they could maybe postpone, or what they absolutely need to deliver. So we absolutely need to deliver a conference this year.
Great. Well, that's some interesting talking points there. So I just wonder, we've obviously touched on hybrid, and there are some challenges around delivering hybrid. And I'm sure that quite a few people who are tuned in today are thinking, how do I get the same kind of experience to translate across two completely different audiences? And I'm going to turn to Sarah in terms of the safety angles of hybrid. Do we have to really consider, from a hybrid perspective, exactly? Do we have to be incredibly stringent on these safety procedures and risk assess absolutely everything to its nth degree? What's your experience been so far, Sarah?
Well, at the moment, as I said, I'm largely doing filming consultants, so there's no audience to consider. Whereas when we move into hybrid, then that's the big differentiation. I think that the hybrid approach in general is going to be the way out of this, because we just don't know what we're going to be allowed to do yet. The roadmap is very generic. We don't have the detail, but obviously we need to start planning. So a hybrid means that you can flex, your numbers and your format around how many people you're actually going to be allowed when that date comes. But also depending on, you've mentioned it, Charlotte, already, your risk assessment, because that is where everything basically comes from. But reinforcing what James and Emma have already said, that this is a chance to reinvent what we're doing rather than just try and recreate. So just kind of trying to redo your event that you did last time before the pandemic is unlikely to be successful once you then add COVID measures, on top of it. So we, again, would encourage everybody to think outside of normal, and how can the networking work? As Emma said, more structured virtual networking is also going to be safer in-person networking. So it's likely that some of those learnings will translate into on-site networking as well. There is going to be considerations around budget. As James said, you've got hybrid costs with the platform and the venue, but you've also going to have some additional costs for measures and staffing is usually probably where a lot of it will go to enforce what you're happening. I think one of the key things to point out is that the roadmap states that the restrictions will be lifted. So the restrictions we have to assume would be the number of people who can attend, and capacities have already been indicated as to how many people could be in a venue. But it doesn't mention the legal requirement to risk assess that activity will be lifted. And my crystal ball would say it's unlikely they're going to remove that. I think that will stay, which means that you can't really predict what measures you will need. That I think there's going to be less blanket measures. So I think, they will remove the legal requirement to wear a mask, hopefully. I think that's one of the restrictions they're meaning. But it might be that your risk assessment determines that actually in certain parts of your event, you do still need to wear masks because it's so dependent on the activity, on the bigger picture that you're looking at. So that would be quite dependent on your audience. COVID safety it's behaviour management, an awful lot of it. So if your audience are going to be nice and compliant, then that's one issue. But if you've got a very different audience who maybe have been working throughout the pandemic, they may be less aware of these, kind of measures. So, you do have a legal requirement to risk assess. You've also got an element of mental safety, which needs to be considered very carefully here as well. And the hybrid approach allows people to make that decision that it might not be safe for their mental health to actually attend an in-person event yet. So this hybrid future that we have can solve a lot of the problems, the risks at the very beginning, and particularly clever event design will make it feel a lot nicer for the guests. So it is about starting, as Emma said, with your objectives and then adding in a COVID secure layer as you weave them in, you weave those measures into your event design instead of just trying to deliver what you've always delivered.
And that makes complete sense.
And just somebody who's put in the chat box is it's very interesting that because a lot of content that you might have delivered live before but is quite static, maybe like things like training, can now be delivered virtual. It does free up your organisation or the business model or whatever to spend more time and attention and money on your live or hybrid activity, because you're spreading the load a bit. This is from Kate Dunn, and I think she makes a very interesting point, because you now will look at the whole thing holistically as to what style of delivery method you use, and make it more appropriate for the content instead of everything having been live as it was before.
Of course, absolutely. I think, as I referred to a bit earlier, I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of people is how to create an experience across two different audience types. And I'm going to come to Pete on this. What are the ways in which to actually create those two? Should they be two different experiences that a virtual and a physical audience should have? And what are the best mechanisms for that, do you think, from a technical perspective?
It's really important that although experiences are naturally going to be different, that everyone feels just as engaged. And just picking up on something that Caroline's asked in the chat, no one should come away from having either attended in-person event or attended virtual event feeling like they've missed out on anything. That's really key. And it starts on really simple things. People at home should be able to see what people in the room are asking question-wise, and vice versa. And everyone's questions are just as important. And there are options for letting people network. We can bring in all. AR, augmented reality, means that people can sit in a mixed group of in-person and virtual breakouts for those networking opportunities. Everyone should come away from the event feeling like they've got what they want from it. And the key to that is making sure the experience for both parties is as close to the same as you can make it.
Sure. I mean, are there some key pitfalls that you think people can fall into when trying to design this? Because obviously it's the design of these experiences, and Emma's quite keen to mention something here, I think. Sorry, I moved to Emma.
I'm always trying to get in there. No, I wanted to say that I do totally agree with Pete that no one should go away from either a virtual experience or an in-person experience and feel that they've missed out. But I think what's also really good from our point of view as planners and organisers is to not lose sight of the fact that actually, we've got two different audiences here. And they have got two different kind of marketing personas. And people in the future, when it's safe to travel and do what you want, people will choose to attend events in virtual because they want to attend it in virtual. And so obviously their expectations and what they want to get out of it and the experience that they're looking for is very different from someone who chooses to attend an event in physical. And so I don't think that in a hybrid event we need to get too hung up on delivering exactly the same experience to each delegate. We just need to make sure that each delegate gets value. And my last point about that is that if people aren't paying to attend, if they're paying for their hotel, their travel expenses or whatever, that kind of premiumizes maybe the in-person experience. And so maybe that's something to think about there.
Yeah.
That makes total sense as well. I just wonder, James. Obviously, hello, James.
So, I was just briefly just to add to that as well, if I may. Another example, again, Bob Bejan from Microsoft because I think in all of this, to reflect on what Pete was saying, content and the clear curation of the quality of the content of the virtual event has to be considered and will often be different to a live event. And he gave the example of the different skill set required for a stage actor versus a TV or film actor. And what we do need to think about as well is coaching and development of those people that are if they're giving lectures or giving talks, they need to realise this is not how it used to be, standing on a stage behind a podium with PowerPoint. And then the second example, a pitfall was a medical association running their virtual event last year, and the president being really, really scared about technology letting everything down. So all of the sessions were pre-recorded lectures and educational sessions, and the complaints came in after the conference that from a lot of delegates saying, "I don't pay to watch YouTube." So
it's a great analogy.
Absolutely, and so it's back to Pete's point there, and I think Emma agreed there as well. They are different events, and they need to be considered very, very carefully. With as much, you can't just copy paste the live environment and expect it to be a great virtual event.
Do you think, James, do you think that people are understanding or accepting of mistakes within this virtual and hybrid arena? Because we are all still learning, whether you're experts in the industry. Technology is fantastic when it works, right? But things can invariably go wrong. Do you think people are accepting of that now?
I think, from what I've seen, I think they are. I think we are. What the events industry is great at is adapting to the challenges that get thrown our way, whether they're economic crisis or in this case a health crisis, and we're adapting. And I think those and a lot of the EVCOM members that Claire works with, people have adapted really, really quickly and are learning fast. And I think your points earlier, Charlotte, you were. And Emma made the point, everyone flipped quickly to Zoom last year, but they've learned fairly rapidly that that's not enough. And actually, the mistakes that were made in the early days are now being learned from, and we are, creating much better events. And an example today, you're hosting from the studio, and it gives a much more professional feel than perhaps it would have done over the Zoom call. And I think it adds to the engagement and the theatre. We still need theatre, and I think we've learned from some of those mistakes that the drama and theatre of live events need to be factored in some way into the digital realm.
I would suggest, though, that people are becoming slightly less tolerant as time goes on, and expectations have risen, because I think everybody is so pushed for time that if you're sat on a stream or a live and it's not working, I'm off. I'm doing my emails, I'm doing something else, and before I know it, I've forgotten about that. So I think there's going to be a real problem pretty soon, which is probably where the Virtual Events Institute might come in, is that there's going to be a skills gap, is how we deal with all of these things, because everyone's going to have to know how to solve the problems, and then also all of these presentation skills, how it all looks, how it appears, because we're all, I think, by nature quite impatient, and we want it to look great. Straight away, and I think we're starting to reach that point now.
Yeah, and Pete, it's very much about the content, isn't it? Really, that's being delivered, irrespective of the delivery vehicle, so to speak. And I mean, you must have seen some interesting cases of some good content, some content that's not been particularly well thought out. What experiences have you had in that area?
Well, the classic is the really small text on slides that people then sat at home trying to view on their phones and not being able to see the data. That's the classic. You have to bear in mind that you have very little control over the viewer. If someone wants to watch from their phone, they will. So it's about making it clear for them. But picking up some of the messages in the chat. Ben's right. TV is a model for hybrid. We just have to make it engaging. A live show from a venue that you're watching at home is much more engaging than a Zoom call. It just is. It's just more interesting to watch. And technology is key, and rehearsal is key. And I think there's a big case for producers of events to step up and make sure that their presenters are really considering the people at home as well as in the venue, especially as we move into hybrid. I think presentation skills are really important. But content is key. Videos are more interesting than slides, and you can overdo it. You can have too many slides in a presentation, and presentation time. You can't have a 2.5-hour session streamed on the internet. People will walk away and make a coffee. It's in shorter sessions with more interest are definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and moving into sort of talking a little bit more about the return to live, or the journey back. It's actually a journey on, isn't it, really? It's not a journey back to live, it's a journey on, because live is now going to look quite different, we think, from what it has done beforehand. And how those safety procedures, I mean, we don't have a crystal ball, really, in terms of, what the back end of the year is going to look like, but we can try to plan for that. And, we don't know whether we are going to be forced to wear PPE equipment and what the rules and regulations are likely to be. So, James, just from a venue perspective, I mean, what procedures and processes have you implemented which you've had to very much deliver to your client base around safety?
Great question, Charlotte. And I think Sarah will be well aware of this with the work she's done on risk assessments, but the industry as a whole for the large venues have worked on documentation and processes that have been wrapped up in something called the All Secure Standard. And that's something that the industry has presented to government as a blueprint to work with, rather than different venues or different cities or different regions going to government with their own rules. It's effectively one set of rules. So those are we've been following the guidelines, the official guidelines, and also working now with the rest of the industry on this particular standard. And there are due to be test events in April that the government will be running, and they'll be monitoring those to that standard. And out of that will come the further guidance for what we're going to be able to do after the 21st of June. I'm also seeing, of course, if you look at some of the hotel groups, Marriott has its commitment to clean policy. Accor has its all safe label. So big corporations are stepping up and presenting their particular COVID policies, because ultimately safety and, if you like, the sentiment of the people that we will want to come back, whether they're delegates, exhibitors, speakers, etc., that is going to be paramount, knowing that where they're going has the right standards and the right credentials, and that we all follow the rules whilst we're in those venues.
Yeah, of course, absolutely, 100%. So, Sarah, just moving over to yours, obviously I know this is your area of specialism. Presumably, I mean, of every venue will have, I mean, if there's a standard procedure that's out there in terms of guidelines, but every venue will have certain anomalies, presumably, how do we navigate that? Should we look to the venue for our answers, or do we have to actually come to the location with what our internal procedures are and ensure that they adhere to those?
I think the future approach is going to be much more collaborative than in the past with health and safety. There was a tendency to do a bit of document swapping, tick some boxes and say that, you know, the risk assessment was done. But now I think we do need to see much more bespoke assessments coming from venues. And particularly what I'm pushing my kind of contacts for at the moment is, that's great. That's a link to how your individual guests are being kept COVID secure. But how's your event space going to work? How are you going to serve food? You know, it's a very different risk. An event group at a hotel or a venue is completely different to, you know, a couple who are going on holiday. So I'm really asking venues for bespoke assessments at an events level. And then once we get into the planning conversation, we then take it one step further and have an assessment process. It's a process as well. It's not just documentation. It's the process of assessing that risk, which we do together, because the venue, so they will be able to give me some much better ideas about how to work my registration or how to work my schedule around their spaces. And then we build that together. I think that's a real key for this step as we move forward. No one knows what they're doing effectively. This is so new for everybody. So we have to really rely on each other's specialisms. James mentioned there that events research programme that's going to be, all eyes are on that at the moment, because their test events are very likely to give us our steps out of the restrictions. They did do a successful one in September, so hopefully they can build on that. And recently there was something exciting done in, I think it was the Netherlands, where they kind of did a test event with very few measures. They had different control groups, and they were able to confirm, you know, a week later that there hadn't been any transmission or any outbreak related to that event. So we would hope that something similar could happen here to give us the evidence on how different measures actually affect transmission at events. Something that is it's mentioned a lot in the roadmap documentation around events and this event research programme is testing. And I know that's quite a hot topic at the moment. We don't yet know if it will be mandated, but it does feature, a few times in that wording in that document. So it's possible that will become part of every event. Is that there's an expectation that you are going to be tested, either at home or a regional testing centre. I'm quite looking forward to that concept taking off. So you don't then have another problem, because obviously once you introduce large scale rapid testing at events, then you do have to think very carefully about the logistics. But equally, it's an opportunity. Going back to that idea that you design your event around your safety, how can you turn that testing process into an opportunity to deliver bespoke content, maybe? So if you stagger arrivals and you have a certain audience arriving at certain times, you can maybe give them some really tailored content that suits their arrival time. And then you can introduce that as part of the wait. So while people are either in their cars or in your holding area, or however you end up doing it, you could use that as an opportunity to engage with them or start kind of getting some content delivery. So, there's opportunities as well with the way we deliver these measures. But testing, it's worth pointing out, is one measure. The reliability of the results is getting better. It's improved significantly if it's delivered by healthcare professionals and not, Joe Public or themselves. But it's still not anywhere near 100%. So testing becomes one of the measures. And something else that James said there about the All Secure standard, what I can see happening is that we, as an industry, create our own guidance as well, is that there becomes an accepted standard. So people have an expectation of what will happen when they arrive, what will happen throughout the event, and the behaviour change will become quite natural because it's just what happens when you go to an event. So from a compliance perspective, that's ideal. So the more uniform we can get across the industry, across venues, across organisers, the more standardised we can come at some of these rules, the higher compliance we're going to have. Having said that, it does still need to be driven by your risk assessment. Just because something's in the measures, it doesn't mean you have to do it. If you're not expecting a queue, you don't need Disney barriers and queue markers and stewards. That would look silly. So you do need to design it around your specific event. And then equally, if there's a risk because of the way your venue is laid out and the way that you're flowing your delegates that's maybe not covered in some of the guidance, that doesn't mean you can ignore it. You still need to work out how can I cut a chain of transmission at this point and introduce those measures.
It all looks like there's a lot of work being done, which is brilliant, and I think that will give a lot of people confidence. I suppose one of the things to consider, and maybe James would have a response to this, is what are the budgetary considerations of all of this? Whose budget does a lot of this sit on? Is the venue going to carry some of it? Is it down to the event organizer? Do you pass that cost on to the delegate? Because none of those things are going to be free. So how's that going to work? And if you're adding the hybrid and the live plus all of these considerations, it could be a problem for a lot of companies.
It's a great question, and it's a debate that's going on. I can't give you a firm answer.
Oh, go on.
But to echo what Sarah said, one of the things our industry has, if you compare something that we've been lobbying government, both directly to DCMS and also through the all-party parliamentary group for events, which sits in Parliament, is to make them aware. And Sarah was just touching on the control elements that we have as organisers. For most of the events we're discussing here, we know exactly who's coming, and we can set out rules and guidance and plan the risk elements of those people attending events. If I go to a supermarket, the supermarket has no control over who's coming in and out of its doors. The same with if I go to B&Q, the same as if I go for a walk in the park. There's no control there. Business events can have total control, and we also, as an industry, are very good, both as organisers, as suppliers, and as attendees, at following rules. It's sort of what we do, and it's in our event DNA, and so we can provide the control mechanism. So I think that's something that we will continue to lobby government so that we have the best possible rules to operate under. I'm slightly dodging your direct question, Claire, on who pays for it. If we go down the route on testing, my personal view, and it's shared by many others, as a country, vaccinations are going to be the big thing, and I think some sort of digitization of whether it's vaccine passports or some way of doing things that don't then put pressure on the event organizer or the venue or the city or whoever it is. I think if people want to get up and running now and they're forced to do that, then that may be an answer. But ultimately, it's vaccinations of the population that will keep the risk down and allow us to measure and plan for those risks.
Do you think, James, again, just with your Excel hat on, are you or have you seen a flurry of activity since the announcements in terms of bookings and revenue, and are you expecting that to be the case for the latter end of this year?
Great question, and I'm pleased to say yes. On the announcement around the pathway out of lockdown, the 8th, 29th of March, 12th of April, 17th of May, 21st of June. So, and we came in the following day with a flurry of inquiries in our inboxes and through some of the venue finders and other agencies we work with. So, in answer, yes, there will be a period of lag, in my opinion. People are not going to start running anything sizable in March, April, May. We might see some smaller events coming in June after the 17th of May. But of course, there's a planning time scale now, and we've got to plan the risk. So my personal view is we'll see strengthening from September. And then that will be a bridge to further strengthening for 2022. And we're currently deep in negotiations for events and conferences from 2022 up to 2027. So
Wow.
the medium term is looking very strong. I think one of the challenges will be around delegate attendance, and I think, and talking to colleagues through my ICA network around the world, a sense that 2021 will be very much national and possibly close regional, but international travel restrictions may keep a lid on that, and then we'll see that easing as 2022 progresses, and that's certainly from our inquiry levels where the pattern that we think will happen now.
What would you advise our audience in terms of the booking times that you're talking about? I mean, if people are considering producing an event later on this year, should they already be having those conversations? Are they having those conversations? What kind of process do they probably need to be thinking about now in order to get the kind of space that they're looking for?
Ultimately, yeah, it depends. I'm hearing stories of venues filling up quite quickly from the autumn period. My advice is, and it's something that we're doing carefully with people that are wishing to be early adopters, is talk to all the stakeholders. Really need to think about managing the risk and the strategic risk of booking something, because we all need to be prepared for the worst and plan for the best. The classic phrase to use. But I think there should be an openness between the planners and the venues to plan in all the what ifs into the contract if they are going to book. It will, from what I'm seeing at the moment, it will be a very busy autumn period, and that's both with a large venue like Excel, but also the smaller and medium-sized venues across the country. So I think there's elements of optimism, but I think we need to go into it with perhaps Sarah can comment on the risk strategies around being very careful that we plan so that if we then need to go to a plan B, that is built in. And certainly we're building in contracts where a client can take space option A or space option B, depending on what the restrictions and limitations are at the time of the event for 2021.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that makes perfect sense. I think there's a lot of contractual work to be done, isn't there? A lot of flexibility that's still required, sort of feeding into next year, perhaps. Finally, just maybe a question for Emma. In terms of the virtual with live events, are you expecting that sort of virtual element still to be streamed during live events? Certainly for the medium term, I guess, which is over the next 18 months or so. Is that what you would expect?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, myself, I expect that it's with us forever, and I say that quite often. I mean, I think. Going forward, there are lots of people who will always choose now to attend events virtually because they've enjoyed the experience. There will be organisers that now just run events virtually. We've talked about the cost of hybrid. Obviously, the cost of virtual is much lower. And also the reach, like James mentioned, that Microsoft event. I think I heard some statistics like usually they have 7,000 attendees and they had 128,000 virtually. So, it totally makes sense to think about how you're going to keep those delegates coming in the future. I think there'll be a move to more smaller events, potentially regionally, with some of the content streamed in from one centre. I think TED Talks actually already did that. So that's kind of good practice that other organisers will be probably doing going forward. I think the travel issue is going to make international events problematic for quite a long time, as James mentioned. And I think the longer things go on, the more we develop new habits. And I think, we're already seeing it in the work from home thing. In the UK here, we've been working from home for about a year. And, there's lots of people now who won't want to go back into the office not 5 days a week as they used to. You know, they've developed new habits. And I think it's going to be the same for events. You know, there are lots of people who aren't going to want to spend the rest of their lives rushing around going to conferences. So I think the organisers obviously really want to get back out to you know, in-person events, but really looking at the behaviour of delegates, I think you would need to question whether we're ever going to be purely physical again.
Yeah. I mean, there is Beth Atherton has commented that, you know, she said event agencies were sort of living with the same model for a very, very long time. And this has accelerated the need to look at things differently and to be able to assess your audience differently and the different needs they have and what data you can gather. And, you know, and she makes a very fine point that it has accelerated the need to think about things differently, and that should and could be a very good thing, and that we look at the whole landscape differently going forward. It's just been a bit of a shock, I think, for everybody to have to do it quite so quickly. But, you know, I think in the long term, it will ensure that the events sector thrives because they're having to think about their audience so much more thoroughly at what they want.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a changing world that we are absolutely living in, and everybody's had to adapt and evolve to what we're now seeing. And you know, we certainly have taken a much more consultative approach in terms of the ways in which we're talking to our client base and trying to help people to navigate their way through it. Because, you know, it's as you're trying to evolve, it's also challenging at the same time. It's not a comfort zone that we're used to sitting in. We're actually out of time, unfortunately, but I am going to give a quick sort of summary of some key points that have been made today, which I think could be quite useful as some key takeaways. To start with, sort of don't let the tech drive the event. Start with what you need, and then go looking for the tech after that. Focus on the content. The competition, whilst we're all working from home, for our attention is much higher. So the content has got to be a lot more engaging to keep us energized. Personalize the delegate journey. Hybrid doesn't mean the virtual and live communities have to have the same experience. Build safety measures in tandem with venues and suppliers. We will need to reinvent the way we design live events to incorporate safety elements. Small rotations of people, no large numbers of people in small spaces, clearly. And testing prior to a live event is a good measure for safety, but it's not the only one. And over-communicate as well with your audience. Publish your risk assessments and safety policies for everyone to see, because that will make people feel a lot more confident about where they're going and that all the procedures are in place. The stakeholder attendee experience is now everything. Digitalization of face-to-face events is the future. Have a backup plan for missing speakers, which we're unfortunately privy to today. I'm very sad that Abina couldn't join us. She was having some technical issues. Bad audio, disappearing hosts, audiences unable to connect, and be ready to adapt. Ask lots of questions, and know you will make mistakes, but you learn from those. So
I can tick all of those.
Yeah, exactly.
All of those.
So those are some things to take away. So all that really remains for me to say is thank you very much to everyone for joining today. Thank you for tuning in. We hope it's been insightful. We have created a white paper based on this topic, which you will be able to download from our website. You'll also be able to have the pre-record content of this session today, and it's on our website as well, should any of your colleagues like to view. So do get online, and we will be sending out some comms around that. And your feedback, as I mentioned earlier, is absolutely crucial to us. So we will be sending out a survey to understand what we could have done better, what kind of content you'd like to hear from us in the future. And so we'd really appreciate your feedback into that as well. I want to say thank you very, very much to all our panelists. You've been really fabulous today, to James, to Sarah, to Emma and to Pete. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. And of course to Claire, who's been absolutely fantastic today, and great to get her insight from an association perspective as well. So again, thank you all very much for joining, and look forward to seeing you all very soon.